Good morning, boys, or good afternoon. Welcome. I'm going to ask that you guys open up your books, your PDFs of Heart of Darkness, and turn to page 63, as you see on the screen here. Okay. While you're doing that, I just want to let you know what your homework is. Okay. Obviously, on Friday we have a quiz, so in addition to everything that we're reviewing today, make sure to go through the rest of Part 2 to prepare for that quiz. Okay. In addition to this video, please make sure to check out the discussion board if you have any additional questions for me. Please post any questions there and I'll be sure to answer you. Okay? All right. So please turn to 63. Okay? So we left off in last class having just seen the attack on the steamship, okay, in which the helmsman dies, okay? If you see there in the beginning of that paragraph, from the moment on page 63, you'll see that Mr. Kurtz is quite Marlowe is quite upset about it. He throws his shoes overboard, right? And in fact, he's quite upset also because he believes that Mr. Kurtz is dead. Okay, and that he will not, which is exactly what he's been imagining himself doing, talk to Mr. Kurtz, right? This special man who's imagined talking to for months now on end. So he's very upset the fact that he won't be able to talk to Mr. Kurtz. Okay, so finally now we've just about reached the interstation after months and months of traveling. Okay. And in fact, now that we've reached this interstation, this section, finishing part 2, is in fact very much about Mr. Kurtz. Sorry, we'll find a lot about Mr. Kurtz in this section. So anytime you see anything about Mr. Kurtz here, make sure to underline it and to think about it quite a bit. Okay, so let's turn to page 64. Okay, I'll say mysterious or kind of odd things that we hear about Mr. Kurtz that perhaps we can't make sense of quite yet, but perhaps it's just worth our looking at. Okay, there at the midway through 64, we see the quote or the passage that begins with a voice. I'm just going to read that for you guys, and just we'll think about them, but make sure to remember them for later. Okay, he's described as being a voice. He was very little more than a voice, and I heard him, this voice, other voices. All of them were so little more than voices. And the memory of that time itself lingers around me, impalpable, like a dying vibration of immense jabber, silly, atrocious, sordid, savage, and simply mean, without any kind of sense. Voices, voices, even the girl herself now. So who is this girl? We don't know yet. We will find out later up in the book. But then Marlowe breaks the narrative. He's silent for a long time. We're reminded that he's actually on the Nelly telling the story. Okay? He then continues, I laid the ghost of his gifts, in other words, Kurtz's gifts, at last with a lie. What lie? We do not know yet, but he seems to be implying there's a lie being told by Marlowe, which seems to be significant considering we already know that Marlowe hates a lie, as we saw in part 1. Okay? In part 2, forgive me. So I laid the ghost of his gifts at last with a lie, he began suddenly. Girl? What? Did I mention a girl? Oh, she is out of it completely. They, women, I mean, are out of it. Should be out of it. We must help them to stay in that beautiful world of their own, lest ours gets worse. Oh, she has to be out of it. Okay, so a few things just to note there. He's described as only a voice, which is interesting. What does that mean, that Kurtz is only a voice? And again, there seems to be a girl to whom Marlowe lies. Okay, she'll be important in the end, just to reiterate. Okay, so and again, we see that theme of Marlowe and women and reality. Okay, all right, let's turn to page 65 now. Okay. 65, we get to learn a little bit more about Kurtz, okay? I just want you guys to remember the beginning of page 47, okay? Or around about page 47 in part 2, where Marlowe guesses why Kurtz turned around from the central station after delivering all the ivory. He didn't really know, but now it seems we get a little information as to why he did start to turn around, okay? So here are some quotes from... Here's a passage starting with My Ivory on page 65. Okay? My ivory, oh yes, I heard him. My intended, my ivory, my station, my river, everything belonged to him. It made me hold my breath in expectation of hearing the wilderness burst into a prodigious pearl of laughter that would shake the fixed stars in their places. Everything belonged to him, but that was a trifle. The thing was to know what he belonged to. How many powers of darkness claimed him for their own? This was the reflection that made you creep all over. It was impossible. It was not good for one either, trying to imagine. He had taken a high seat amongst the devils of the land. I mean, literally. You can't understand. How could you, with solid pavement under your feet, surrounded by kind neighbors ready to cheer you or to fall on you, stepping delicately between the butcher and the policeman in the holy terror of scandal and gallows and lunatic asylums? How can you imagine what particular region of the first ages a man's untrammeled feet may take him into by the way of solitude? Utter solitude, without a policeman, by the way of silence, utter silence, where no warning voice of a kind neighbor can be heard whispering of public opinion. These little things make all the great difference. When they are gone, you must fall back on your own innate strength. Okay? Your own innate strength, upon your own capacity for faithfulness. Okay? So we start to realize that, in fact, the reason Kurtz turned around, and what seems to be the problem with Kurtz is that, as he says here, that the powers of darkness had claimed him as their own. Okay, the powers of darkness had claimed him on their own. Right? He has that. In other words, he has become one with the wilderness. He has been taken by the wilderness, by the heart of darkness. Right? And it seems that without the external checks of policemen, pavements, neighbors, all right, public opinion, all right, Kurtz has fallen mad. He has no restraint because, as it says here at the bottom of the passage, he could not fall back on his own innate strength. Okay? So, okay, Kurtz has been initiated into the heart of darkness. Okay? So how did he get initiated into the darkness? How did he lose himself in the jungle? How did he lose his civilized persona? Okay, so on page 66 we see the original Kurtz. This is the Kurtz that had the European Kurtz, the civilized Kurtz before he entered the heart of darkness. Okay, so this is the page top of page 66. The original Kurtz had been educated partly in England, and as he was good enough to say to himself, his sympathies were in the right place. His mother was half English, his father was half French. This is important here. All Europe contributed to the making of Kurtz. Okay, what seems to be Kurtz's, well, let's just put it this way. Kurtz seems to embody or symbolize Europe, civilized Europe. Okay, he is the greatest example of civilized Europe, we could say. Okay, perhaps he even embodies Europe. Okay, and by and by, I learned that, most appropriately, the International Station for the Suppression of Savage Customs had entrusted him with the making of a report for its future guidance. And he had written to it. I've seen it. I've read it. It was eloquent, vibrating with eloquence, but too high-strung, I think. 17 pages of close writing he had found time for. But this must have been before his, let us say, nerves went wrong, and caused him to preside at certain midnight dances ending with unspeakable rites, which, as far as I reluctantly gathered from what I heard at various times, were offered up to him. Do you understand? To Kurtz himself. In other words, boys, it seems that the natives of the inner station worship Kurtz as something of a god, okay, which explains their wailing in the fog from the last reading, all right, that unrestrained grief. The natives were scared that they were going to take Kurtz, their god, away from them. Okay? To continue the reading. But it was a beautiful piece of writing. That is the report. Okay? The opening paragraph, however, in the light of later information, strikes me now as ominous. He began with the argument that the whites, from the point of development we had arrived at, must necessarily appear to them, the savages, in the nature of supernatural beings. We approach them with the might of a deity, and so on and so on. By the simple exercise of our will, we can exert a power for good, practically unbounded, etc., etc. Okay? Now, gentlemen, there's one other note about this report that apparently Kurtz wrote when he was in Europe that got him this job. Okay? This report is said, to continue here, this was the unbounded power of eloquence, of words, of burning noble words. Okay? There were no practical hints to interrupt the magical current of phrases, unless a kind of note at the foot of the last page, scrawled evidently much later in an unsteady hand, may be regarded as the exposition of a method. It was very simple, and at the end of the moving appeal, a very altruistic sentiment at the end of that moving appeal to every altruistic sentiment, it blazed at you, luminous and terrifying, like a flash of lightning in a serene sky. Exterminate all the brutes. Okay? So something terrifying, something dark seems to have been revealed at the heart, the depth of this man's soul, having been in the jungle for as long as he has been. Okay? This man embodied Europe, all the fine sentiments of Europe, all the idealistic visions of Europe, but deep down, now that he has been in the jungle for a long time, without any sort of inner strength, has revealed something dark, something definitely very uncivilized. Okay? So, that's page 66. Let's now turn to page 67. Okay? Here's, we're talking about the helmsman. Okay? Speaking of the helmsman. Okay? Kurtz says on page 67, poor fool, if he had only left the shutter alone, right? He had no restraint, just like Kurtz. Remember that word restraint, we used it to describe the cannibals who, for some mysterious reason, did not eat the pilgrims on the boat, despite the fact that they must have been starving, okay? The cannibals seem to have some sort of restraint, which Kurtz and many of the pilgrims do not have, some sort of internal check, okay? A tree swayed by the wind. As soon as I had put on a dry pair of slippers, remember he threw his shoes out because they were filled with blood, the blood of the helmsman, I dragged him out, and after first jerking the spear out of his side, which operation I confess I performed with my eyes shut tight, his heels leaped together over the little doorstep, his shoulders were pressed against my breast. I hugged him from behind desperately. Oh, he was heavier than any man on earth, I should imagine. Then, without more ado, I tipped him overboard. So Marlowe, despite his fondness for the helmsman, unceremoniously just tips him overboard. Right? Both the pilgrims and the cannibals are upset for different reasons at this. Right? The pilgrims are upset because it's so unceremonious, so uncivilized. The cannibals, as you can imagine, upset because perhaps that's a meal for them to have. Remember, they're very hungry. Okay? They're upset because they wanted to eat the dead helmsman. Okay? All right. Now let's turn to 69, okay? We're in the inner station, and we meet a new character, okay? He's a Russian, okay? He's described as a harlequin. This is on the top of page 69, okay? And by the way, he's the owner of that book on seamanship that he found earlier on in the river, okay? And it turns out that the marginal notes were not cipher, but rather Russian, okay? So very quickly here, just one small passage to describe him, right? His aspect reminded me of something I had seen, something funny I had seen somewhere. As I maneuvered to get alongside, I was asking myself, what does this fellow look like? Suddenly I got it. He looked like a harlequin. His clothes had been made of some stuff that was brown holland probably, but it was covered with patches all over, with bright patches, blue, red, and yellow. Patches on the back, patches on the front, patches on the elbows or on knees. Colored binding round his jacket, scarlet edging at the bottom of his trousers, and the sunshine made him look extremely gay and wonderfully neat withal, because you could see how beautifully all his patching had been done. Okay, so this harlequin, he's called a harlequin because of the patches on his clothes. And I guess one question that we have to ask later on is, what is the role of this character within the book? Why has Conrad introduced him, right? One thing that we do get, though, is that it seems that Kurtz is not merely worshipped by the natives of the interstation, but also, it would seem, by this harlequin, right? The harlequin seems to be something of a disciple of Kurtz, right? He says at the bottom, Marlowe asked the harlequin, don't you talk with Mr. Kurtz? And the harlequin responds by saying, you don't talk with that man, you listen to him. Okay? So just a few thoughts about, concluding thoughts about the book, about the part, sorry. We do get to see a lot about Kurtz in this section, about what happened to Kurtz, and also how it happened and why it happened. All right? Mr. Kurtz seems to be the embodiment of civilized Europe, who is removed from all external checks. And as a result, because he has no inner strength, no inner checks, seems to have succumbed to the heart of darkness, okay, and has become worshipped by the natives, okay, gone rogue. All right. He's also described as a voice. He's an eloquent man, right? A man who is perhaps all talk, right? You listen to him, right? And we'll continue that theme as we or that thought as we continue into part 3. Okay, so that's it, boys. All right. If you have any questions, just a reminder, please ask them on the discussion board that I'll post on Schoology. Okay. Thanks a lot. I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.